So, chapter 2 is about tools of environmental science, and 2.3, we're talking about how to make informed decisions. Well, we make decisions every day, right? And in order to make a good decision, there are certain steps that you got to follow so that you're making the best decision possible. And that's no different from making decision in environmental science as well. One other thing you need to understand is something called values, and values are basically the reasons for your decisions. These are the things that you consider to be important, and value is different from person to person. Some people might, think certain things are more important than others. So you might think, some of the environmental values are very important, and other people might think some of the economic values are more important. So it really depends on each person, and but these values is what is going to ultimately affect what the decision that you're going to be making. These are some of the values that might affect decision making, or these are some of the ones I'm going to be talking about. You can have aesthetics might be something, whether it's something, maybe you want to protect a forest because it's a beautiful place to be. um, Economics almost always plays a role in environmental decision making. This has to do with money and jobs. This is environmental science, and we're going to be looking at environmental values, protection of natural resources. Um, there's educational values to consider. There's ethical, moral, whether it's right or wrong. A lot of environmental issues have to do with health, how it affects our human health. Some of these places that we are trying to protect is, just important to some people because it provides area for people to go hiking and hunting and fishing and things. So these are recreational. It might give us more better understanding about what's going on. So has scientific importance, and there's also cultural and social importance as well. So these are, and again, depending on who you are and who you talk to, everybody's going to have different values or what you consider is important in making that decision. So there's this decision making model. It's not that complicated like the scientific method, and it's something that you probably do anyway without really thinking about it. But if you kind of break it down, you can see that these are actual steps that we go through. So it's a conceptual model of analyzing environmental issues. So let's say there's this person, Michael Price. This is your book's hypothetical student. He's deciding to vote on whether or not to protect this nature reserve for this bird, right? That's maybe endangered or something. So what's the first thing he's going to do? He's going to gather some information. Before you make any decision, you want to find out more about it, right? You might be watching the news or reading some papers. You might talk to people. You might look things up. So you basically have to do your homework and, get some information. Maybe in the process of looking things up, he's finding out that this bird is the population has been declining for the past several years, and he feels that that's something that needs to be addressed. So now you're gonna consider values. Well, so what's important in making this decision? And there's a lot of different things, but you might want to focus on certain things. So in this case, he is looking at things like environmental values, some economic values, and maybe some recreational values as well. Okay. Somebody else looking at the same issue might have a whole different set of values that they're considering. And then you want to look at the consequences. So, will be some of the consequences of the action? Some of them are going to be positive, some of them is going to be negative. So, if you were to set aside this, a little piece of land for nature reserve, what are some of the good that's going to come out of it? What are some of the bad that's going to come out of it? And that's kind of and what is it for the different values that you're looking at? So the things you have up here, these are the values, right? You can have economic values and environmental values and recreation values, and also you want to look at both the short-term consequences and the long-term consequences as well. So I'm not going to go through this whole thing, but as this person is looking into and after gathering all the information and kind of consider the values, these are some of the consequences that he think is going to apply to this situation. So, in terms of environmental consequences, there's some negative and positive, right? You gotta stop the habitat destruction if this this nature reserve is going to be in place, but it might kind of lacks some of the protection in some of the surrounding areas. So you might have one area that's protected, but other places might not. Um, and then there's also kind of long-term consequences. Or in the long term, the population of these birds gonna increase, and even some other organisms, because you're protecting the entire area. But then you have to worry about the other areas since you're putting all your focus on this area. And in the same way, you can look at the economic impacts of building this reserve. Some might be good, some might be bad. Some of them are more for the long term, some of them for the short term. And there's also recreational impact as well. Just keep in mind, I'm going to have you fill out one of these boxes for one of the environmental decision that you're going to be investigating. And you might not fill every box. There might be some of these boxes might be empty. Maybe you can't come up with a long-term negative consequence of something. Um, but that's okay. You're not gonna fill in every box, but you're gonna try to do the best you can. So once you kind of basically look at the pros and cons of the situation for the different values, then it's time to make a decision, right? And again, somebody who is going to have very different values going to think, maybe it's more important to think about the landowners and what they're going to get out of it rather than this bird. Or maybe some people are more interested in having preserving this area for bird watching and for fishing rather than particularly about the bird or even about the landowners. So it's the decision is going to vary from person to person, and the reason for that is because they have different values. Okay, so I'm going to have you practice this in class, but as you think about, and this applies to every environmental decision and also pretty much any decision making process as well. You might not go through this entire exercise of different values in positive, negative, long term, and short term, but you're kind of already doing this whether you're thinking about which college to go to, or maybe even thinking about what should we do about this whole climate change problem. There are various values to consider, right? There's the environmental values, almost always economic values. Money and jobs is always important. And other values as well. And then you also want to look at the pros and cons, and what's immediate benefit versus long-term benefit and all that kind of stuff. Okay, so basically that's the decision-making model. It's pretty straightforward. You gather information, you consider what's important and what are the reasons for these decisions, and then you look at the pros and cons and what are some of the consequences of this action. If I do this, what's going to happen? If I don't do this, what's going to happen? And what's the good and what's the bad that's going to come out of it? And then you finally make a decision. So that's the process.